Please welcome Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. And thank you all very much for joining. I confess I am surprised. So I expected this to be a much smaller crowd coming to a first thing talk on the ethics of influence, but here you are. A few ground rules. If you want to butterfly and flit to another session, no harm, no foul, please feel free. And also I'm fine with, questions or things along the way. We can keep this conversational if you like. I will not expect that necessarily, but you are welcome to if something is burning and you would like to interrupt, feel free. And I'm actually, as I say, really curious about the people who are in the room today. So I'd love to start off with just a little bit of like, who's here today? I wonder how many of you are today in coaching roles in your organization? Quite a lot. How about in managerial or leadership kind of roles? Quite, okay, right. And then just sort of on development teams, but not the previous kind of thing. Okay, all right. Okay. That's very interesting. And I also am wondering how many of you think about ethics at least once a month? Wow. Okay, once a week? Once a day? Okay, this is great. Again, I confess myself surprised and I am delighted and I think this is going to be a great conversation. And again, thank you so much for joining. Most of what we talk about today is going to be about influence inside the organization. So not necessarily about influence when it comes to users. We'll touch on that a tiny bit, but about what the implications are as we try to change minds within our organization. This is traditionally the slide where I try to convince you to listen to me because I know everything, but I am not going to do that here. I am instead just going to try to identify my position with respect to this problem. My name is Elizabeth Ayer. My pronouns are she, her. I live just south of Seattle in the USA. But I worked 20 years in Cambridge, and so I'm sort of back and forth between them occasionally. This is my first time back since pandemic, my first time in front of a live audience since pandemic, so again, thank you for your grace. I also spent a long time in the private sector and now have transitioned to public sector work. So you might have discovered I like crossing boundaries. Boundaries are my thing. And so now I'm working, as mentioned, for the US federal government, but I also work for an organization called Conflux on organization design, doing some team topologies consulting. My background is generally product-ish, but much more of what I do now is leadership work and again, an organizational work. And if you've ever heard of me before, you probably will have heard of me through my blogging, which essentially is about taking things that the industry holds dear and trying to really have a go at them. Yeah. And so that's what this talk is about too. And something that I came across that really started to bother me. It really started to rankle is about influence. And if you search online about, influence topics, you will get how to increase your influence, more, always more. But if you think about that, and we're all trying to increase our influence all of the time, it just becomes this cacophony of voices. And surely sometimes we also need to step back. But you can't find that. You can't find information about when to influence. This is the approximate result of my searches about when to influence. It's not a lot out there. And again, I think this is really indicative of the way the industry thinks about influence, thinks about what we should do. It tends to be more and more and more, and not questions about when should we influence, when should we not, when should we step up, when should we step back. And so it became a topic I got really interested in, especially also with, Black Lives Matter and movements like that, about stepping back, about giving space. It was a topic that I really wanted to try to make sure I baked into my own work. Commercially, the answer to how much to influence. So when we're influencing users, basically the answer that companies have settled on is everything, everywhere, all at once, as much as possible. And there's very little sense of, wait, should we do this? And for all I hear about, in the previous thing, solving user problems and things like that, fundamentally, we know that companies are trying to charge rent and continue user problems, and they're trying to exploit. And we know this, right? And okay, maybe this is my positionality in government and public interest tech that I think hard about this. But that's what we know they're doing. And so we get examples externally of excessive influence in things like dark patterns. And this is, you will have heard of these before, I expect, but they're patterns that get used to try to draw the user into things that may not be in their own interest. So, for example, many days I will get something like this from LinkedIn, and it's engineered not to give me information and value. It is engineered to get me to their platform so that they can use me in other ways. I get that. That's a fairly benign example of influence that is used in these platforms. But then there are some really dark patterns over there. So for example, this one came out earlier this year about a startup trying to use chatbots to support teens in mental health, which as an aspiration, okay, we can understand trying to improve mental health for teens, but experimenting on suicidal teens with a chatbot is maybe crossing an ethical line that we want to be careful of. So this everything, everywhere, all at once approach is something that really needs to be examined both internally and externally. I can get why companies make this decision. I get it. They will be outcompeted by other companies who are going to, potentially be doing these things instead. So I'm not going to make, strong judgments about the companies doing that externally, but internally are the places. Oh, yeah, let me just mention one more before I go into internally. This is a great term for this called asshole design, is these examples of when you're constraining or, trying to shape user behavior, not to benefit the users, but to benefit the company and to try to entrap people. And the reason I wanted to mention this is that, when we come to ethics is a weighty, worthy subject, yes? But fundamentally, it's not a lot more than, don't do asshole-ish things and try to do the opposite, yeah? And so I want to just wanted to take a minute to talk about ethics as not necessarily needing to be like ponderous and weighty philosophical subject, which it is, but it's also just something which is about trying to not be that guy who is the exploitative guy, but to be the good guy instead in this. And of course, inside a company, you have many more sanctions, you have many more reasons to act ethically. It's obviously the case that you have repeated relationships with people. So social sanction is likely to be much higher if you're doing things which are crossing ethical boundaries, and obviously doing pro-social things has a longer term payoff in terms of trust and impact, positive impact. And obviously you have more reasons to try to engineer good cultures within your organization by acting ethically. So I hope, because you all think about ethics, that we're already on the same page that ethics is good. But just in case we're in any doubt, some of the longer term impacts are that it may increase trust, lower stress, lower risk as people are actually behaving in more consistent and predictable ways in a business, and improve personal well-being. The reason I say may here is it's also super interesting that there isn't solid research that it does. And this is one of the things that in that small bit of when should you influence press out there, it is noted that there is not necessarily a measurable correlation between organizations which promote ethics and have an ethical culture and either business results or psychological safety and the kind of environments that we want to be in. This is not proven. Now, this could obviously be because nobody bothers to study it. So, I'm not trying to say that it isn't the case, but it is not a done deal that this works to get the things we want. But I think most of us probably believe that it does and are probably willing to work with that as an assumption as we go forwards. The other reason to be promoting an ethical culture, and I wanted to mention a little bit about the downward slide and the kind of shifting of ethical windows that happens. People have a tendency to try to behave consistently in organizations. And so if somebody does something on the side of ethics, that tends to become the norm unless there's a countervailing force, because we'll try to act consistently. It was okay before, it'll be okay again. And so you get sort of a slide into this sort of flexi-ethic zone and all the way into other spaces of people behaving dangerously or in ways that don't benefit the whole. So I think another reason to be paying attention to it and to try to think about when and how we exert ethical force is because if we don't, there's an inevitable slide towards pragmatism. So these are reasons for us to think about it, which most of you already do, and it's great. And I would love to hear your reasons at some point as well. That's the motivation for ethics, but I also realize that I haven't really talked about what I'm even talking about with the word ethics. So I'm just going to take a minute and roll back and give the lightest of light introductions to moral philosophy. I am going to start off with utilitarianism in one key sentence, which is greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So the greatest good for the greatest numbers. That is one ethical philosophy. It is almost certainly, from what I can tell, from what other people write, the dominant philosophy in tech companies is utilitarianism, is consequence-based. Outcomes, outcomes, outcomes. What you do, the impact you have is the measure of your success, more than the character or quality of your actions. But there is also a counterforce there, often called universalism, which is about duty-based, that it's what you do, it's the actions you take. You know, it's not okay to lie to get some other result. I lied, and that's not okay. So, you know, in the other philosophy, it might be you lie to get your outcome. It's probably all right as long as we can all agree that the ends justify the means. But with the duty-based version, you cannot do that. You must respect other people's humanity and dignity above all else, and only then can you consider the outcomes and be flexible about it. So those are the two sort of dominant philosophies here. And I think, personally, I think that they have interplayed in ways that are actually quite subtle in the work that we do. This is actually how I see it. I see it as the world used to be primarily utilitarian, and that's what we all did. And then Agile raised its hand and said, but people, and actually occupied a middle ground where it could achieve better results through that humanistic attitude and posture and methods. And so it occupied a space between the two. But it actually brought in that universalist mentality about, you know, humans being important in the work we do, and that actually being the dignity of people, the reciprocity of the work we do, being something that is essential to our long-term success and our well-being. So this is sort of how I see the world, that Agile actually came in and occupied a really helpful space between them and started to kind of inject the humanity aspect into the software work we did. Utilitarianism, I want to spend a little bit longer on it because it is so dominant in the way so many of us think. It has a couple of really big downsides as tendencies. One of them is it does embed a concept of acceptable human damage. So as we talked about with the mental health situation before, you know, those teens who were experimented on were the acceptable damage in order to get, hopefully, you know, good chatbots that could help the mental health of people later. But that acceptable damage does tend to concentrate in the same people. It tends to concentrate in the vulnerable because we're talking about the greatest good for the greatest number. So those who are on the margins get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So utilitarianism has this tendency towards that in general. And a concentration of power. The other thing utilitarianism has this slight downside of is somehow the people who are in power, the greatest good for everyone is generally to keep them in power. It is a remarkable coincidence how this comes out so often. And so, but those of us from the outside looking at it say maybe they are not actually judging the greatest good for the greatest number of people very well. You know, we start to ask questions. Among the questions that I'm hoping is in your mind right now and has been for a while and sort of itching there at the back is, wait a minute. Aren't power and ethics orthogonal? Like, you're talking about like influence and power and ethics over here. And, you know, you can be ethical good, ethical bad. You can have all the different combinations, right? And I think one of the things that we've seen repeatedly is no, they're not. Because, like, I present Exhibit A, the billionaires, right? Because as you gain the power and influence, there's a strong tendency to lose touch. So if your ethics is about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, you then get a really weird and skewed perspective about what that greatest good is. And yeah, I mean, all I can say is Twitter, we're done. I win. It's clearly there is a relationship between increase in power and a decrease in ethics. And again, that raises the key question as we try to navigate our power and influence about how do we actually keep in touch as we gain influence. And I think, you know, although we can point to, you know, there's almost caricature baddies up here, it happens, we've all seen this happen in our organizations too, that as people gain influence, often they will lose the connection they had to the original places where they, you know, where they were doing some good. And that is a really strong tendency. It's not, I think that's one almost, you know, I won't call it a law of nature, but I don't think that's something that you can escape. I think that's a really natural sort of thing to happen unless you have an ethical foundation and try to mitigate against it. So this becomes the key question. How do we stay ethical as we gain influence? And I think the answer, or an answer, that I'm going to propose here today, and you all please be the judge of whether you agree or not, but I think the answer is also in this diagram of like injecting the humanity in it. Okay, we started to move this way with Agile. What if we keep going in this direction towards universalism a little bit and actually try to prioritize the needs of the humans we're influencing over the needs of ourselves or that organizational thing we're trying to embody? And this for me, I find this a really, really useful phrase. This phrase, no decisions about us without us. This is a long, long history phrase. It traces back at least to 1505 Poland. So, I mean, like, it's long history there. It has, Eastern European political traditions. It cropped up in the 1990s in disability justice in South Africa. And from there, it went to a number of different groups who were trying to, argue for their rights. I came across it, in indigenous rights in the Pacific Northwest. But I think this is a wonderful phrase for trying to remember, just a watchword of, am I making decisions for other people without involving them in that decision making? And so I think we can actually make this into an ethical spectrum. So there's a spectrum between where the change maker is changing somebody without their consent, all the way through to the change maker being there to support self-determination. And we can actually situate change methodologies along this spectrum about how much it is the change maker's agency being implemented versus the change maker's skills being used to elicit the agency from the people being changed. And now we get to have some fun with talking about, okay, where do things sit on this spectrum? This spectrum, by the way, crops up in a lot of places, this underpinning to how people think about a number of different areas. So first of all, like at one end of the spectrum, you have things like coercion, violence. At the other end of the spectrum, you have things like convergent facilitation, clean language, some of these other techniques which are about trying to take the change maker out of the seat of agency. But it's not just about, facilitation and coaching. It also came up. This was from the turn of the 20th century from Mary Parker Follett. I don't know if you've come across her as a management thinker, but she was very important, influential on many of the people who became influential in the 20th century. And she had a philosophy of power over, power with, and power to as being the direction of management, transition and ethical improvement on that. And so that framework that she's using is already embodying that power over from influencing somebody without their consent to power to trying to support people's self-determination. It also has come up from design. So designers have been thinking very hard about these issues. Massive respect to the design community. And I was heavily influenced by somebody named K.A. McKercher, who works in New Zealand in social justice projects. And there they have a framework of design at, design for, design with, and led by, which again embodies that sense of how much consent or agency does that person being changed actually have. And so we can situate things like user-centered design. It's on there, but it is not the pinnacle of this because usually user-centered design is implementing the company's will with the users. We're trying to change the user's behavior, as we heard so often in the previous keynote, but it's still the company's will on that. It's not the user's will. It's the company's will. But that can transition in certain types of projects to co-design, where you're actually trying to elevate the people with lived experience into a role of actually co-deciding, co-designing with you on this. And then all the way through to design justice at the end of that spectrum about trying to prioritize and give power to the folks on that end of the spectrum. The theme here, though, is to align voice. The word of voice is used in HR literature a lot, employee voice. But the point is to align voice in the decisions with where the experience lies and who will be most affected by it. So it's not just who has most impacted by things going forwards, but also recognizing who actually has the real experience of these challenges. Now, in my work in government, I don't get to do like co-design and design justice. It's about what Congress wants. And, we try to do the best we can to make that, good for people. But we do not get to take what they want through our means. They have to express their needs through the ballot box, comes back down at us. And that's how we can do things like that. However, inside organizations is a great place to experiment and to work with principles like co-design, which I'll speak a little bit more about later, but these methods which actually work to shift the power. We may not be able to do that with our external users, but we can use that with our internal communities to try to actually build consensus, build the will, and actually design solutions for organizational problems around what the people affected need. Okay, now, change techniques and the ethical spectrum. Hopefully this is the fun part. Not that the other part wasn't fun. But I want to start with change management frameworks. And these are the various patterns to effectively carry out change in an organization. And before we start, I want to say I actually quite like change management frameworks. I think they're really good thinking tools for how to actually present things and to do the work. And in fact, I'm going to pick one I really like in order to critique it. But this model is one of many. There are many out there, but I actually really quite like this one. It's called ADCAR. It's put out by a group called ProSci. But the point is for the change maker to embed change in changed people by, first of all, setting awareness of a problem, then promoting desire for change, improving the knowledge. And so if we take an example like let's say you're trying to do a DevOps transformation. So you're actually trying to get a development team to take on operational responsibility. The first thing you do is you highlight the awareness of, well, there's really a problem here between your need for speed and their need for safety, and we need to, do this some other way. You might then work on their desire. Hey, it's new skills. We'll get you in the job market better. This is good for you. And then you work on the knowledge. Okay, what is the DevOps culture? What are the techniques and technologies? The ability, you give them the access to do the things that they need to do, and then boom, you get your results, right? So it's not too bad. However, if you're using it for maybe a change where you were, say, ending the Agile coach role in your organization is not quite such a happy thing, right? Like the point at which you have the desire, like the desire of the Agile coaches to leave, really? The desire of teams to eject their teammate friends? Like, it starts to get real, weird at that desire point where you're trying to make people feel a thing to get your change across. And so I think this one, like many change methodologies, there's some ethical, in this. So first of all, the two-state is already decided here. We have decided that we're going to, terminate the Agile coach role. And there's nothing in this rollout of it which actually lets the folks who are most affected by it have input. Now, they might have through some other process. They might have. It's not like you can't use this method with something where you actually took input another way. But the method itself doesn't actually require that people have had any say in that decision whatsoever. This desire part, there's a real risk of gaslighting people here. There's a real risk about, trying to make them feel a thing in there. So it's a little bit, and finally, there's no real openness to change. And this is a one-way thing. There's no sense of reciprocity where the people being changed can actually say, we have a better idea or we have another solution or things like that, right? This method is one-way directional in terms of implementing change at some people. And it's for that reason that I'm going to give it a pretty leftward kind of position on the spectrum. There's not a lot of consent in something like this. I mean, you're consenting by virtue of being in the company, but of course, quitting your job, that's borderline coercive to have to leave your job. So yeah, it's over there on that side. Moving on, we'll talk about influence spotting a little bit and some of the more subtle methods that people use influence in organizations. Say covert influence, and these are all not necessarily bad. So one of the things about this talk is there's a lot of gray area. It's not very up with the zeitgeist of everything being black and white. It's not black and white at all. I mean, you start off with, say, the personal connections and hidden agendas. Well, I've seen marginalized people use this very effectively to try to address systemic issues in their organization. They're not keeping their agenda hidden because they're bad people. They're keeping their agenda hidden because they'll get punished if they don't. And, it's definitely ethically, I wouldn't say that that's wrong. So these things are not necessarily bad. They're things to be careful of and to watch and to do checks on yourself about if you start getting involved in some of these covert influence type things. Information quality is another one about how we pass information around the organization. So another place where we see subtle influence come in is, when we're reporting our status up, is it really green? What even is green? But to be fair, most of what we're passing around is judgments, right? It's not facts that we're passing around when we say status is good. We're passing around some kind of judgment on it, which is also trying to make sure that it's meeting the standards of other people and all that. So again, it's not that taking judgments and presenting information in certain ways is bad, because we're called on to make judgments all the time. We are knowledge workers. It's what we do. We make judgments. We make guesses about the future. We have to do this. But it's another place where you probably just want to check your position with it. Am I making that assessment because it's good for me, or am I making that assessment because it is what is really needed in the situation? Does it represent reality a bit better? Does it represent it worse? So I think there are ways and places to try to check yourself as you do these things. And it's not necessarily that these things are bad about, adjusting information as it goes through, because it will. It's judgment. It will change as it goes through people. But again, it's a zone to be careful of. And finally, this is actually one that I confess, I have used this to my advantage many times. The framing issue. What I mean by framing is, how you present something or what options you choose to give people. And I, from a product background, that's what we do, right? That is exactly what we do. And it's one of the magical things about the role is that often it's not just sort of facilitating decision making, but it's structuring the decision in a certain way. And that could be good for me. It could be good for the company. It could be good for my end users. But that's another place where it sneaks on in there through all kinds of places. And the framing is a really subtle but really potent way. I mean, if you're all in here to be evil, you can use this for nefarious purposes. But if you're not, that's one of those places where it's really useful to check yourself and understand where your motivations and your intentionality might be being expressed in preference to the people who are being affected by the decision. So just to talk a little bit more about framing and framing privileges, do y'all remember nudge? That you recall that the whole nudge thing where it was all about choice architecture, and the key thing here was you put the salad bar before the pizza. And then people will get the salad and not the pizza, yeah? And so it's about trying to make sure the choice architectures are setting defaults so that you default to actually paying into a pension and doing things so that the theory was that we're trying to make people do things that are really good for them, but we're doing it through framing, making the decision look a certain way and trying to, kind of do that to it. And again, it's not necessarily bad, but the people in many of those cases, the people being affected didn't have a say in do you want to be healthier? Or, do you believe that this is how you want to eat, how you want to live? They didn't get that chance to have the agency. Somebody else is taking that judgment about what is better for them and then shaping them all into it. And the shapers, the nudgers had the thing, but they still have full choice. We have abridged no aspect of their choice, but you have, right? The way you present choices is influencing, and there's no, you can't escape that. And that doesn't make it bad. It just means it's a place where we need to stay aware of that as we go ahead and do things like that. I also, I have a number of things that I hate in this, the mental health article I hated. Here's another thing. Oh no, this isn't it, but this is it. The thing, something else I hate is, some of the message, some of the information conveyed through images. And this is one I took off of an actual bit of leadership training that I stumbled across for other reasons. And I'm so fascinated by this because it has psychological game playing on one side, action with integrity on the other. That's one spectrum of game playing versus integrity. And then in the other direction, you have politically aware and politically unaware. But then the animal choice here that they have picked, it's clearly trying to tell you that being politically aware is way better than being politically unaware. Because who wants to be a sheep or a donkey, right? You don't want to be that. However, psychological gameplay, yeah, kind of okay. Yeah, that's fine. Acting with integrity, whatevs. And so the message involved in framing this in the training, and the whole point was to actually categorize. This was for a leadership training where you categorize your workers and then try to manage them in certain ways. Yeah, that's part of the UK Future Leader Scheme training, by the way, if you want to know an actual location. And I hate it so very much, but it's a great illustration of ways that you get messages through in your framing, which maybe somebody making this might have wanted to go, whoa there, is this actually, is this right to be, is this ethical, is this solid, is this, this is right for me to be implying these messages here. So yeah, nudge and choice architecture, sure, you're still reserving some freedom for people to make their choices within it, but how you think affects what you think. And so you don't get off the hook by doing, clever framing tricks. You don't get off the hook for that not being influence that needs ethical inspection. It sure does. So yeah, we're going to make it better than change management, but still not quite to the fully ethical methods. I've mentioned user-centered design. I am assuming that I don't need to go into details of user-centered design here. You can read about that if there's any doubt in your mind, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on co-design, especially because it's a term that I think gets really misused, generally to mean user-centered design. And so I want to talk a little bit about, what co-design is. It's, my understanding, my interpretation of co-design, and you talk about its location all the way over there on the power with part of the ethical spectrum. So the principles of co-design, and this is why you don't actually see it very often, like the number one principle, and this is, again, I'm quoting Bekircher here a lot. I think they have a really good, solid, complete package about explaining what this is, how you do it, and all that. So I highly recommend going off and looking at the resources. But the number one thing here is that you share power. And that's something which most folks and organizations find very hard to do. They do not habitually say, how can I generously give over the power that I have to somebody else, as evidenced by the wealth of Build Your Influence articles, right? This is not something that most folks are sitting there thinking, how do I have less influence and power and build up power in other people? Apart from this room, of course. Just want to make sure I say that because you think about ethics, and that's awesome. But that you don't see it very often in organizations, and certainly not with their external their external users. It prioritizes relationships, so it takes a flippin' long time to do this because it actually requires the building of trust and relationships in order to have that safety to make change together. And so it is not transactional. It is looking for a long-term relationship between two communities. It uses participatory means. It tries to make sure that folks are brought together in some kind of thinking together kind of capacity. And fundamentally, it must build capability in the people being changed so that they leave folks better and better able to take decisions in this area than they started off with in the first place. I am putting this in there mostly so that you can check it out if you are curious in slides once you get them all the slides are getting posted right after these talks, so you can go and take a look at this. But the idea is still a build stuff, learn stuff, build stuff, learn stuff loop. But there is a lot more emphasis in a cycle like this on the relational work, on ensuring reciprocity, on trying to make sure that both voices are present, not just in articulating options, but in that decision itself, and are legitimately there. It's not just some kind of sham, but are genuinely present in deciding on options. And again, I think there's lots of kind of co-design where you bring people in to kind of do things together, or things called co-design. But I think that, for me, to really merit that title, it's a rare thing in the world right now that I've seen. And often we can do it better inside organizations than with our external contingency. But it's rare and it's important. And I think it's a set of techniques which are really worth studying in more detail. And so we have a spectrum of change-making methods, an ethical spectrum. This is just my take. I am actually pretty happy to be argued with over the location of various things and say, no, you need error bars that look like that. Yes, I know. It is a representation, and I'm happy to have discussions about it. But I think that, when I look at the fundamental thing about whether the change maker is imposing will on people versus eliciting will from people, that's how I see that playing out. And that some of these methods, while they aren't necessarily used for unethical purposes, they have tendencies to embed the will from the changers. And so you need to treat those with some more caution and care if you're trying to promote an ethical practice in your organization. Some tools. So I do want to present some tools in addition to just these different frameworks about how to approach ethics and things like that. Now, I don't know if you've all gone out there and studied and Googled, you probably have, but you will know if you have that the major way of trying to address ethical problems and challenges is by interruption of your decision making and checks and asking yourself a lot of questions. This is a good thing because trying to get into practice of making sure that we're taking a pause and checking ourselves is, that's a great habit to get in. But it also is super challenging because it's very easy to check and be like, yep, we're fine. Tick. Even with a pretty good will, it's hard to genuinely pivot on this. And all of you have experienced this, new information, we pivot, we're agile. But pivoting is actually really hard, especially for ethical reasons, especially if you have to justify a pivot to another person. So I will say that there are caveats around the utility of these tools, but the primary method, and I think these are good checks to do. I think they're things that are important to build in if you can. And so I will mention them. But the whole thing is, what good questions can we ask ourselves to try to make sure that we're promoting ethical practice? And I've got a couple of examples here. I don't know how we're doing. We're doing well for time.
All right,
We're doing great for time, and it means we will have time for questions, which is awesome. But one of them is a positionality reflection. So just taking some time to analyze yourself with respect to the problem that you're trying to solve. Another one is a thing called an equity pause that I found very useful. And actually, 18F uses these habitually now to try to just say, take a minute and check out ask some questions about what we're doing, whether it promotes or decreases equity. And then some checks on yourself if you're trying one of these co-design methods. Wait, hang on, are we really? And being able to recalibrate from there. So in a little bit more detail, a positionality reflection is going to depend on what that problem is that you are engaged in. But as a general thing, some of the general questions you can ask yourself are things like, what is my interest in influencing here? Is there anyone who actually is better in this role than me right now? And should I be making space for that person to be here instead, or at least to come join me in this? And do I have some relationship to some aspect of this problem that nobody else does? So what is my unique thing, my unique relationship to this project or to this problem? And here, I can do an example. With respect to this talk itself, I did a quick positionality reflection. So what is my interest in influencing here? Well, I'm super annoyed by the ethical monoculture that I feel like we have with, just what I feel like we're experiencing. I want to have a plurality of ethical voices. I want it to be okay to say the word ethics in an organization and actually make some decisions, have that be impactful. And so I'd like to validate those of you who think about ethics. Like those of you, I want to say that's okay as a subject of discussion. And I want to have conversation around it. I want it to be okay to discuss in our communities more broadly. And beach is nice. And I like coming here. But if I'm going to be honest with myself, coming here and being able to do this conference, the conference was a draw. So I put those things in. I've got some virtuous reasons. I've got some self-serving reasons for wanting to be here. And that's what the positionality reflection can do, is make sure, if you're going to do it, be honest with yourself. Be a little bit brutal about what your real motivations are. Is there anyone who should be influencing here instead of me? Well, I hope you will all tell me, because I would like to know that. I don't know of people who are doing this specific thing out there, but I hope they are. I'm really hoping, this is part of my way to answer this question, is by putting this out there and say, here are the things I am seeing. Who else is doing work in this area that we can bring in to potentially be here and do a better job of this than me, a more thoughtful job? And what do I have that nobody else does? Yeah, I'm willingness to do the work and be here, but it's pretty thin, right? Fundamentally, I don't have a relationship to this problem that other people don't have. And so on that score, fundamentally, maybe my time would have been better finding that person who could do a good job and had some, maybe ethics background, academic background. I don't know. But this is what we've got. So this is where we got to. I did not pull out of this talk I did not actually, pivot based on that, as you can see. So maybe it didn't have the impact you would hope for from a pause like this. But I thought I would give it an example of what this might look like if you're being honest with yourself and your position with respect to the problems that you have in front of you. Another tool, and this is the one that we're using quite extensively in our own project, which is called an equity pause. And there are a number of different versions of it. This is one from a thinker called Ayer. And there are some key questions in this, and some of the key questions, I'm not going to read through all of them, but the question of inclusion, who are we not hearing from, I think is incredibly important, both in your user-facing work, but also in your internal work. Why aren't there voices here? Who isn't here? Who is really related to this problem that is not in this room right now? And I think it's a really powerful question, and that can often lead to some changes in approach without necessarily having a radical pivot to a whole new thing, but to bring those voices in who belong there. And so taking a minute to just inspect that can be really powerful. And similarly with acknowledging history, this is another thing I find with sort of transformation efforts very often won't notice what happened before or what's in flight, things like that. Maybe this, one of those things that civic tech is probably worse at than other places. But we come in saying, we are going to fix everything, instead of taking the 20, 30 years of work that people have been doing in government to try to solve some of these problems and building off that work and engaging the people who already have a long time commitment to the problem space to try to fix things. So those are some of those things that it can raise in people's minds that aren't necessarily there through our methods and through the things that we read in the business press and all of that. But some of those things that can help us change what we're doing to try to be a more ethical change maker. And identifying your implicit biases, that's actually a really hard one, but that, again, I'll just note that one as being worth doing the work to try to identify your biases. And sometimes that can come through decision tracking for yourself. So try to, take a look at some of the decisions you make and what do you notice about them? Just that question, just that practice can have an enormous impact in you noticing some of the things you tend to do and tend to think. I noticed I was a lot more risk averse than I thought I was. I thought I was, yeah, come on, bring on the change. And then when it actually came to it, there's a lot of, well, about it. So I think it's really helpful to try to look at yourself in that and some of your biases in other spaces as well. And the last tool to talk about quickly, the CoDesign quick test. If you think you are doing CoDesign, you think you are engaging the right people in the change itself, here's some questions you can ask yourself. Like, was there really mutual learning? Did you go in telling, or did you go in expecting to be changed and then be changed by the experience? Did that happen? Was there some degree of co-deciding? Again, not just articulating those options together, but of actually taking that decision where sometimes you didn't get your way, but the person you were co-designing with who had the lived experience maybe did get their way or their preference. And so that, again, a question, if it always just happened to come out with you having your decision being the one that kind of went through, or your preference being the one that went through, again, it's just one of those things, say, maybe there's a little power issue there, possibly, not necessarily. It's possible that you're just objectively right all the time, but it's a thing to look at. It's possible. Just like Elon. And the other thing about, the people with lived experience, were they recognized for their time? So one of the really habitual things, both with external users and internal people, is people are asked to do things as extracurriculars. And the question is, did you actually make the space for them within the span of their job or the span of their time or whatever that recognition looks like to participate in the thing you did? Or did you have the time because you were in that managerial role and they just did it as an extra for you? At which point, again, all kinds of other ethical challenges ensue. So just to recap, the business literature implies more influence is always better. And we should all try to influence and we just have the marketplace of ideas and we're done. And I would like to come back and say, no, more influence is not always better. As asshole design is a handy aide-memoire for some of the things where influencing is not always a good thing. The more is not always better. I believe that Agile has represented a small ethical shift from utilitarianism, very small, but I think it's worth building on that from just that consequence-based, that ends justify the means kind of attitude towards the things where we elevate and respect each other, where we prioritize reciprocity and valuing the agency and humanity of the people we're working with. There is an ethical spectrum. We spent some time on the spectrum. We talked about the change methodology where they sat sort of naturally on that spectrum and therefore how much caution one probably needs to have when using those methods if you're trying to promote ethical practice. And then the benefits of pausing to question and doing it for real and doing it in a time scale where it can be impactful, like any kind of pivots you might have. So I hope this has given you a few tools, a few things to think about, maybe even just some framings of things you already knew and believed. I'm very happy for us to have some discussion. Oh, no, wait, there's one more before discussion. One last major risk. I'm so sorry if you probably already do this if you think about ethics a lot, but it's really easy to overthink this also, and to get sort of tangled up in the ethical implication. Like you watch terrible things happen because you say, well, I'm not sure I should be influencing here. And that's actually a genuine risk of this. And so I think, one of the things to do here is to make sure that you're applying these techniques, which are time consuming, which are an investment, apply them where it matters and, don't let that tangle you up. So I just want to end with an exhortation to be judicious about how you choose to use these things. And then, yes, quick acknowledgements of some folks who've been super influential. They've been cited along the way, but I wanted to bring them together in one place. And then some space for conversation.
We've got a couple of minutes for questions. And the first, yeah.
So your point about agility has made a tiny difference. So one of the ethical dilemmas I wrestled with, so my question is, what's your take on this? Have you seen, because Steve said we should make statements. Agile emphasizes self-organization, degree of self-management. Our coaching styles are about helping people come to self-realization and change. What if people decide they want to do things exactly as they are at the moment? What if their choice is not to change? And particularly if you're an agile coach and you've been employed by the boss over there to make them change, and you're giving them the power and they're saying no change. So as an agile coach, what do I do?
Yes. So had I spent a little more time on talking about my experiences with CoDesign, I would definitely have mentioned this one because a lot of times people don't want to change, or they don't want to be in the position of taking the responsibility of the decision making. They don't always want it. And from my perspective, this is just, sort of my take. I think that leaders have a responsibility in that. I don't think the coaches have a responsibility in that. I think the management structure, like the formal management structure, has some responsibility, as decision makers with a span over some of that area to, again, just set some direction for folks. And that can be, it's going to be over here, for these reasons, for that, but again, putting the decision making where the consequences lie sometimes actually means kicking it up a management chain. And this is actually one of the things I think is really interesting about governance. I think governance is a much maligned word and actually really fascinating about trying to move decisions around to where they belong. And for me, that's sort of my view on that. I think coaches can only, like you say, be brought in by the leaders, but it's the leader who then needs to set a certain direction, a zone of, this way, and within these guardrails we can decide, but actually set some boundaries on that. So that's my take. But also, companies are not going to be fully, there's no fully bottom-up power to the people kind of thing within a company. A company has some, differential power structure, which it is going to reproduce. We have other structures which are fully democratic. Companies are not them. And so I think that also, where does the consequence lie at different levels of that company? And that's, so that is my sort of take on it. Definitely a problem though, especially when you really know they're going to be happier on the other side and they don't want to. And it's like the fundamental problem of transformative change is that people don't know what they're going to feel like on the other side, but you just know. But and that's really frustrating. So I think you can motivate, but that's what I think.
I think there's an important lesson here too for any of the managers or the business leaders in the room. Don't outsource all of your change management to consultants and the coaches and be like, it's all right, they'll get them all to change. I've done it.
Most of them don't know what they bought into when they hire coaches and they decide to implement the McKinsey report.
Yeah, well, and are they going to back you up as well? So there was one more question if it's quick.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It was sort of similar, I think, to Alan. But so you sent me into turmoil, probably a good thing. I've passed some of the tools doing this, but what I was going to say was I feel like I've had to resort to nudges in psychologically unsafe environments to get people to come and co-design. How ethical is that?
Ooh, should we break out the charts and plot it? Oh shoot, I did the framing. See what I mean about overthinking? And I think it's really complex, and we should have these conversations. I guess that's the main upshot. I think that's important for learning, but also for deciding what even is the right course here. That's a thing we should be having as small communities who are passionate about these things and can come to a resolution of that. There aren't easy answers, and I love that question.
I'm also feeling thrilled that I did not bribe everyone with candy this morning.
Did not need to.
So thank you all very much. That's our break time now.